Good morning and welcome to Travels with Monkey Boy. Today we are on day 5 of our journey to Scotland. Remember, this is 1999 that we're traveling in the spring. So, March 30th, 1999. I'm not one much for believing in omens, but when we got up, walked down the stairs, and Frankie puked in the lobby, well, that just didn't seem to bode well. As we were downstairs getting our breakfast, we chatted with our waiter. He said we must be getting the Orkney Island ferry, and I said yes, and that we were excited. He said he thought people like us who made reservations were always wise. And I said, we didn't make ferry reservations. And he said, what? He said that if we weren't lined up by 5:30 a.m., we wouldn't get on the ferry that day. And now it was 5:27. So we grabbed a piece of toast and raced to the ferry stop. Bad omen number two, Frankie puked again as we were driving along. Of course, we made the ferry in time. This was the low season, but I basically paid the ticket and they rushed us on board and closed the door behind us. Being all of a bit discombobulated, what with the early hour and the no breakfast and the Frankie puking, we fuzzy-headedly grabbed a few possessions from the car and went upstairs in the ferry. We knew full well from our experience with the English ferries that any time during our journey we could get to the car and get all of our supplies. It was maybe 15 minutes before departure as we climbed the stairs to the ferry deck. The ride to the Orkneys would be about 2 hours. The cabin looked quite comfortable and not too crowded. First of all, Jilreen took Frankie into the bathroom where she threw up again. At this point, she was ahead 3-0. But then she seemed happier and we found seats. The great engines of the car ferry rumbled away as we sat waiting for departure. The whole boat vibrated from the engine rumble as if we were in a great metallic beehive. Frankie laid down and almost immediately went to sleep. Jilreen sat next to her, comforting her sick child, when she said to me, I'm not feeling well. Could you go down to the car and get my Dramamine? As the words left her mouth, we heard over the cabin loudspeaker, we are set to depart. All doors leading to the car park have now been locked and secured until we reach the port in Stromness. Jilreen looked at me in fear and horror, but I reassured her that the message must be wrong. And besides, there was a shop on board and a medical center, so don't worry. First, I went to check the door to the car park, locked and sealed. Then I went to the information desk. I asked the nice man there if I could get into the car park. It was important. He said that no, it wasn't possible. Government rules. I mentioned that only a year before we were on an English ferry and they let us into the car park. And didn't they have the same government? He apologized but said rules were rules. I then asked if he had any Dramamine. He told me, oh, you don't have to worry about that, sir. It looks like a smooth, calm sea today. I said, you don't understand. My wife is ready to throw up from the motion while we're docked. I said, did their shop carry any? And he told me, no. I then asked about the medical service, and he said, since the new National Health Service, they could no longer give out Dramamine. It required some sort of paperwork, so they just stopped the service. He did helpfully suggest my wife move as far to the front part of the ship where she would notice the motion the least. I went to Jilreen and told her the news as the boat was pulling away from its piering. She accepted the news grimly, then went to the front of the boat, stopping in the way to barf in the ladies' room. For at least an hour, Frankie slept. We were back in the children's area while Jilreen was at the front of the boat barfing. Alex played his game gear and I watched the sun come up over the waves. A couple of times I walked onto the deck to smell the crisp, cool air and watch the Orkney Islands get closer. It didn't take me long, though, to be chilled to the bone, and I would go and check on the kids. I watched Frankie sleep for a while, and she's such a pretty girl. It gives me pleasure to see the peacefulness of a sleeping child. She was wrapped in her mother's raincoat and spread out lengthwise across 3 cushioned seats in this deck area. She began to stir a little. Her eyes fluttered a bit, then opened. She looked up at me, smiled, and then heaved. Now, people talk about projectile vomiting, but I'm not sure I ever really witnessed it. Generally, when people get distance and vomiting, it's just because they're standing and the gravity from that height gives the impression that the stuff is flying. Well, not here. She projectiled. She was laying on her back, lifted her head not 2 inches from the cushion, and barely enough for her chin to rise above her chest, and with one deft little "Ralph," she sent the contents of her stomach in a line from her chin to past her shoes. Mind you, lying on her back, and this was past her shoes, and her shoes were lying on the floor 2 feet past her feet. Alex and I only made it out with our lives because when we heard the little burp, we dove for cover. The brunt of the damage was to her mother's raincoat, so I took the poor little girl in the poor vomit-crusted raincoat into the bathroom and commenced cleaning. Frankie insisted she felt better, and once I had her cleaned up, and she went to sit with her mother. I rinsed and rinsed that old jacket in the big industrial men's room sink until it and I were thoroughly soaked. Then I put it in a backpack and went to check on everyone. The ladies were doing fine. In fact, after Frankie got up to her mother and told her tale, the two of them went to the bathroom and puked together. Who says family vacations don't bring us closer together? At this point, the score was 5-3 in Frankie's favor. Alex and I, needing a breath of fresh air, went out onto the deck to a gloriously rising sun that was now highlighting in the misty air the wondrous old Man of Hoy. Hoy was the little southern island we were passing. This was a rock that was maybe the width of a house and maybe 1,500 feet high, standing alone 100 yards off the main Orkney Island. With the shadow and the sun playing off of it, I can't imagine that anyone has ever seen it look more beautiful. I would have taken a dozen pictures of it, except, of course, the camera was safely locked in the car in the car park. But it was a special feeling watching it with my son by my side. I quickly raced inside to tell the girls that they had to come and see the famous old Man of Hoy. Jillreen informed me that A, it wasn't famous because she'd never heard of it, and the only reason I knew about it was because someone had shouted, "Look at the famous old Man of Hoy." B, it was just a stupid rock in the stupid water. C, she had to go vomit. D, if I woke up Frankie to see a rock, she would kill me. So Alex and I went back and hid in the kids' room and rode out the final half hour in safety. As we got into the car and pulled onto the island, we all felt happy to be on firm ground again. Of course, I didn't want anyone to get complacent since we had only 3 hours until our flight, and we had a lot of Orkney to see before then. As we pulled off the boat, Frankie felt much better and had a safe 6-5 lead over her mother. Our first stop on the island was a beautiful little park. There were daffodils and tulips popping up in picturesque little clumps. There were wild swans swimming in the loch of Hooray, and the kids and I took in this beauty from the car as Jill Reed got out and puked into the lake. It was kind of like 3 pukes, but Frankie would only give her credit for one, saying that though she stopped distinctly between each one, it was more like one long protracted one, and she was just stopping for air. So the score stood 6-6. Ever the gamer, though, when we got to the famous Stones of Stenness, as you can see behind me, arguably a more impressive stone circle than Stonehenge, and older. While the kids and I ran in circles around the stones, Jillreen took the lead. At this point, too, since the winds on the island were about 90 miles an hour, I tied Jillreen's raincoat to the bumper and let it flap into the wind. The kids and I could barely stand the cold as we ran up to each of the great stones, but we all considered it preferable to being near the car and watching Mom retch. Besides, the exercise and fresh air were good, and after half an hour, our cheeks were rosy and we went back to the car, untied the raincoat, and prepared to go on. I suggested that since we had nearly 3 hours into the flight, we should drive the 30 miles up the coast along the windy coastal road to see the famous Skara Brae. Hey, I had done my research, which was one of Europe's oldest, perfectly preserved Stone Age settlement. After removing Jillreen's shoe from my rectum, I decided maybe we could just drive to the airport and rest until our flight. Jillreen slept in the car until flight time, and the kids and I went into the surprisingly nice Kirkwall Airport and ate ice cream and read more of The Hobbit. The flight was one of those wobbly 24-seat prop planes. The ride was bumpy, and Jilreen became the first person I've ever seen on any of my million flights barf into the barf bag. All I can say is, so that's why they have barf bags. It was quite neat. She folded up the bag and politely handed it to the stewardess. The plane landed after about 20 minutes, to my surprise, in Sumburgh. I assume the plane went to the capital of Lerwick, but Sumburgh was on the extreme southern tip of the Shetlands. Our destination was Hillswick, which was on the extreme northwestern side of the main island. But the Shetlands were small islands, and it would be maximum 1 hour by car. So we picked up our rental car and began the drive. The first thing we noticed as we drove were the very small animals. The Shetland ponies are famous, and while they weren't everywhere, there were many fields where we saw them. Equally curious were the Shetland sheep. They were also about half of the size of a regular sheep, same in every way except shorter. The other thing you notice about Shetland is that there are no trees. Well, okay, there's few trees, but only those forced to grow by the will of stubborn people. There are no naturally growing trees here. The reason for the no trees and the smaller animals is the harshness of the climate. The weather here is either windy and clear or windy and wet, so big animals and trees would be quickly blown off the island. Only short, squat things close to the ground had a chance. The storms here are famous for their fierceness, and apparently they had many strong storms in the last week. But today, glorious sunshine, cool and windy. The cliffs driving up the southern coast of Shetland were beautiful, but very similar to the east coast of Scotland. Mostly by this time, the kids and I were starving, and Jilreen, after a day of sleeping and puking, was awake enough to realize she needed food before we did anything else. We found a place to eat outside of Hillswick, had a reasonably good lunch, and then we went to our bed and breakfast. Now, don't underestimate the significance of this. We have never been bed and breakfast kind of people. We both felt kind of squeamish about staying in someone's house and having to share a living area with them. Neither of us are naturally outgoing, so this kind of thing was a big challenge. Then the other big challenge was the look. Almara's B&B, from the bottom of the small hill driving up to it, looking like, well, it looked like the little wooden office out in front of a trailer park. In fact, there was an old trailer parked outside. This was advertised as their bridal suite, I think. There were sheep roaming around the front yard, and the whole exterior screamed roaches inside. When we knocked on the door, this old, haggardly woman greeted us. She was Marcia Williamson, whom I had been emailing to arrange this. There could not be a nicer person in the world, but frozen in time. At the outside of this house, with this burly old woman greeting us at the gate, well, if we could have run, we would have. But there is a certain finality about paying deposit money, and where the hell else were we going to stay in Hillswick, Shetland Island? But soon all of our disappointment turned. The bedrooms were clean and new and nicely decorated. The living room area was indeed shared, but it had a satellite TV with 100 channels, including a number of cartoon channels. The kids immediately made themselves at home. Jilreen threw the bags on the floor and immediately fell asleep. I sat and talked with Marcia for a little while, and then she told me of a glorious drive to the coast, just 10 miles west and north of where we were. I went and asked the kids, and to my surprise, Frankie jumped at the idea. Alex stayed to watch cartoons, and Jilreen, yeah, would you wake her up? So with me and my best girl by my side, we drove to the coast, and we were well rewarded. We parked right next to the lighthouse and watched as the sun was getting low in the sky. We were in an area of massive, massive cliffs with huge rocks around us, seabirds in the sky, and more of those kind of needle rock formations off in the sea. It was really special for the two of us, and we walked and talked and threw rocks off the cliff. I pointed out to her that in this relatively clear sky, there was one rain cloud, and I showed her how you could see that it was raining out in the sea. She said it was too bad that we hadn't brought our raincoats and my lucky rain hat. Not 3 minutes after she said that, that one storm cloud came over our heads and dumped on us. Okay, I know I said we didn't get rained on the rest of our trip, but this was not really rain as much as a demon cloud. Within 10 seconds, we were both drenched. We raced to the car, and almost as soon as we got to the door, closed it. As soon as we got the door closed, the rain stopped. But we were in the car now and in the mood for some exploring, so we drove along the coast a little way. We drove down a great hill and came to a shoreline covered with small rocks. Since the tide was out, I thought this would be a good chance to take Frankie out to see the tidal pools. We got maybe 50 yards from our car when, as God is my witness, the same cloud found us, gushed water on us again, and again we raced to the car, closed the doors, and again it stopped. At this point, we knew that we were dealing with no ordinary cloud, so we gave up, drove back to Elmira, and met the rest of the gang. Jill Reed was now up and feeling very refreshed. The kids were hungry, so we drove 20 miles into Burrivo and had just a super meal. Great pizza and unbelievable desserts. We ate to bursting and then drove back. Back at the B&B, we met a charming couple from Australia who were visiting their eldest daughter. They were having a private dinner served by Marcia, but they invited us in to chat. We sat and had a glass of wine and then soon after went to bed. Tomorrow our quest would come to an end. Okay, that's it for now. Let me show you the map as we covered a lot of ground today. Again, to remind you, there's our home in Green Bay. We're coming from Jeddah. Here's the United Kingdom. There's Scotland, Edinburgh, where we flew into. Loch Ness that we had been before. John of Groats. And here is Thursoe. This is where we slept, and we took the ferry up to Stenness. In Stenness, we got off the ferry with our rental car. We went to see the standing stones of Stenness. And instead of seeing anything else, we drove to Kirkwall for the airport, got on a flight, and flew from the Orkney Islands, which are here, all the way up to Sundberg, which is in the Shetland Islands. And as I mentioned, the airport was in the far south. We had a rental car and we drove up to Hillswick, which is, as you can see, northwest corner. Frankie and I took the drive over to the edge where the lighthouse was, and that was our day. Thanks for coming along with me. More again tomorrow.